the words of Rabbi Sidney Akselrad. A flood of memories overwhelms me as we go about the temple grounds. So many thoughts and so many feelings. There are so many people who have given of themselves in so many ways to Congregation Beth Am, to our faith and people and community. We, as part of Beth Am, know very vividly who have worked so hard to make Beth Am what it is. There's a movement to name this area after so-and-so and another area after someone else, but somehow the temptation was overcome with the feeling that Beth Am is truly a house of the people, and everyone is a part of Beth Am. Someone once said to me, "You don't see any names. It's anonymous." To me, it isn't anonymous. To me, I see so many people who are willing to give far beyond their egos, thinking in terms of Jewish life, of their children, of future generations, and hoping that people would continue to enjoy. In a way, I see so many faces before me, people who have risen above self and who have invested self in our people and in our faith. Without them, I would not have been able to do what I have done to serve the congregation. Those words were spoken in 1993 when Rabbi Akselrad created a video tour of Congregation Beth Am, and that video project, coordinated by F. Cannon and Ron Schilling, lives on the Beth Am webpage if you want to see it. Tonight, on this most special evening, it is a delight to celebrate the legacy of Rabbi Sidney Akselrad with our annual Akselrad lecture. We, of course, as we did earlier, welcome Lisa Akselrad and Audrey Smith, and certainly a Beth Am community here that continues to miss his presence. And those of you who know me well generally know that I don't talk about myself other than references to sports fandom very often from the Bima. So I will note that this will be the last Akselrad lecture I'll coordinate as a rabbi at Congregation Beth Am. And so much of my time at Beth Am has been dedicated to building on the deep legacy of bridge building and justice that was championed by Rabbi Akselrad. I'm proud to have served a community that sees Tzedek as a pillar of who we are. And I'm proud of the various initiatives and alliances we've built, ranging from our faith-based community organizing work with the IAF, to our work with area farm workers, to our ongoing fight to access high-quality early education, to our commitment to reproductive justice, and the fight for unimpeded access to the ballot box. I've been touched by the many people at Beth Am who are willing to constantly tone their tzedek muscle and who continue to stand on the shoulders of the Akselrad family. And while I never personally had the chance to meet Rabbi Akselrad, my hunch is he would have really enjoyed meeting and knowing Rabbi Michael Lezak, our distinguished Akselrad lecturer for this evening. While in the past, Rabbi Lezak has served synagogues across the Bay Area, from San Mateo to San Rafael, he is now on the cutting edge of faith-based service and social justice. Rabbi Lezak helps lead Glide Memorial Church's Center for Social Justice in San Francisco, an organization whose mission is to create a just and loving community to alleviate suffering, to break the cycles of poverty and marginalization, to restore dignity to each San Franciscan and help them on their pathways to stabilization. Rabbi Lezak brings over 100 civic and healthcare leaders on Glide's annual pilgrimage to Alabama. He spearheads groundbreaking work with law enforcement and district attorneys from around the country to help them understand the challenges faced by people living in deep poverty. He's on the board of Truah, the rabbinic call for human rights, an organization that I'm remarkably committed to. And I found out these two things tonight, and I think they're super cool. He was the rabbi who bar mitzvahed our executive director, Jeremy Regent, at Peninsula Temple Beth El. And while, Jeremy, that's pretty cool, his wife, Rabbi Noah Kushner, was Cantor Spall's roommate when they lived in New York City together while they were students at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. That's super cool. So It's a delight to welcome Rabbi Lezak to our bima this evening.
Shabbat Shalom. Such a blessing to be here with you all. I just do need to ask before I start, anyone besides Cantor Spall and myself and Debbie Muckamal who were in the Holy Chase Center with the High Priest of America, Bruce Springsteen, last night? Anyone with us last night? Sunday night? I know Kathy and Fred, Debbie's luring me to go back. I saw yesterday there were tickets still available if you want to. It's a master class, I'll just say it that way. Before I start, I want to give a little love, firstly, to Rabbi Prosnit for your toweringly menschy soul. I already vibe and sense in the room how much you're going to be missed and wish you deep blessings on the pathway to Wisconsin. To Cantor Spall, I'm sure you have stories about my wife before she was my wife, when she was your roommate. To Jeremy Ragent, who I think of as like a pint-sized boy with an angelic voice. You should get him singing here whenever you can. To meet your son, Lev. Like, I'm full, like, can't believe that you're anything other than a 15-year-old boy, but sometimes life moves on. To Debbie Muckamal, I'll come to you later. And lastly, what a zechut, an honor, a privilege it is to be here this Shabbat in particular, as together we lift up the memory and the righteous work of Rabbi Sidney Akselrad, to his daughters Audrey and Lisa. I hope that your father's luminous presence pulsates in this room tonight, and I hope that you carry with him every step of the way. Thank you for the stories you brought tonight. So, as Rabbi Prosnit said, maybe you read, I'm a rabbi. I work at a place called Glide, not a traditional rabbinic job. When I was at HUC, I didn't think much that I'd be at a place which I'll tell you about momentarily. It's a giant justice juggernaut in the Tenderloin neighborhood in San Francisco. Some of you, when you hear Tenderloin, you might get a little worried or afraid. I'm here to tell you, it is hands down the friendliest neighborhood in San Francisco, the most generous neighborhood in San Francisco. I'd love to welcome you, your congregants, your confirmands, your bar mitzvah students. Let's talk. I have business cards. If you don't know, at Glide, we serve over 800,000 meals every year to people who are hungry in our town. We give out 1.5 million clean needles to people wrestling with addiction. As our harm reduction program says, we want to meet people where they are, not where they're at, not where we want them to be. One of the first people I met when I gave a sermon in the Glide Sanctuary was an Israeli Jewish woman who said to me on a Sunday morning 8 years ago, she said, Glide is my shul. I've been coming every Sunday morning for 20 years. And to my particular Jewish brain, I wondered, what would an Israeli Jewish woman be coming to church every Sunday morning, right? It turns out she had been a heroin addict. And not many synagogues I know of on the planet know what to do with a heroin addict, but Glide does. We're going to give you a hot meal. We're going to give you a clean needle to make sure that you stay alive and healthy and safe while you're using, and we helped get her off. She's there now every Sunday. On top of this, Glide is also a historically black church. Every Sunday morning, we have 2 celebrations with a 30-member gospel ensemble and a 7-member change band. This rabbi is telling you to come to church. You should come on Sunday morning. It will change you. It will root you. It is more spiritually alive than pretty much any sanctuary I've ever been in. Tonight, I'm going to share with you some stories about how I became the rabbi at Glide. Perhaps one of the, strangest, funkiest, wildest rabbi jobs on the planet, and about some of the transformational work that we do together. It all started with a book and a boat ride and a book. About 12 years ago, I was taking the ferry in San Rafael past San Quentin. Anyone been on that ferry? It's a gorgeous ride, beautiful ride into San Francisco. And I was reading a book called The New Jim Crow. Anyone know the book, The New Jim Crow? About racism and the mass incarceration system. I'd never been inside a jail before, and somehow I got myself inside about a month later, and I was teaching 50 men who were serving very long sentences at San Quentin, Psalm 118, which is an incredible psalm, the capacity to turn your life around. And there's a line in the psalm that it says, Even ma'asu habonim haita lerosh pina. The stone that the builders threw away, right? That disposable stone that we thought ended up becoming the cornerstone of the building, right? Hold that for a minute. Like, I'm sure you've had many construction projects here. You want the finest stones for your sanctuary. That stone that you're like, we're going to toss it. It ended up becoming the cornerstone. It's often translated, but the Hebrew, it becomes the capstone of the building. That disposable stone. And one of the men I was teaching said, Rabbi, that's what people outside the walls here at San Quentin think of us. They think of us as disposable people. They don't want to know our stories. As I looked around that room that I was teaching that day 11 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, I noticed that the racial makeup of that room in Marin County was the inverse of the county outside. Right? Marin is maybe 90% Caucasian, but the room that I taught there inside San Quentin was 75% black and brown men. And so I took note of this. I stood up that Rosh Hashanah at the Marin County Civic Center and talked to my congregants that this new Jim Crow thing is not just in Alabama. It's not just in Texas, but it's actually just 3 hills south of the synagogue. It's in our town and on our dime and on our watch. And I said we thought we should build out projects to get our congregants into jails and prisons around the Bay. Fred Ross Perry, good to see you, my sweet man, who used to lead services, came to San Quentin a few times with us. Yes? Many? Yes? Still doing it. Every month. I need more stories. We would visit jails and prisons around the Bay doing restorative justice work. We would visit Jewish inmates. The woman who runs our Chever Kadisha, the group that ritually washes bodies of people who have died and sits with caskets, we were invited to the prison in Solano County where there is a prison hospice, right? Hold this for a minute. Prisoners taking care of dying prisoners, and there were 2 Jewish men who helped service the prison hospice there, and they wanted to learn about Tahara and Shmirah, right? They wanted to learn about the ritual washing of dead bodies. They wanted to learn how to sit with the caskets. And when we were done teaching them, they toured us in the prison hospice, and to see men who were incarcerated taking care of other men who were dying was one of the holiest sights I've ever seen. Somewhere around this time, I called my friend Debbie Muckamal, I'm sure a deeply treasured member here at the synagogue, who was one of the most righteous people I know, mom of the Hall of Fame teenager Zoe. Debbie's one of the midwives of my justice work, and I said, if we could raise money to bring someone to our synagogue to talk about criminal justice reform work, who should we bring? And she said, there's this guy named Brian Stevenson. You might not have heard of him, but you should bring him. And so bit by bit, we raised money, and about 6 months later, Brian Stevenson sat in the sanctuary. I want to weep. The congregation wrote a shalom, and the room was packed to the gills. His stories, his justice Torah, his luminous and immeasurably righteous and prophetic soul levitated the room. He shared brutal stories of ongoing systemic racism, of the work that he and the Equal Justice Initiative do of getting people who are wrongly convicted off of death row, right? Hold that for a minute. The Equal Justice Initiative to this date has gotten over 140 primarily men off of death row who were set to be executed, who were often guilty of nothing other than being a person of color, often in the South. And they've gotten them out, in that room that night, Brian summoned us all to the individual, communal, and collective work of healing this 400-year-old cancer of racial trauma and terrorism in America. At the end of his talk, Brian told stories about a museum and a memorial that he and his team were building in Montgomery, Alabama, a museum that would tell the birth story of systemic racism in America and its evolution into mass incarceration and mass poverty of people of color, and that there would be a memorial that would remember 4,400 known African American victims of lynching. At the time, 12 years ago, I looked at my wife and to our 3 daughters who were 12 years younger than I, right? A little, and I said, we should go to the opening. And so we held that thought. The Haftarah for this week for Parshat Tzav is from Ezekiel, and it says this, V'natati lachem lev chadash v'ruach chadasha eten bekirбechem. And I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit into you. I will remove that heart of stone from your body and give you a heart of flesh. I spent 18 years in the congregational rabbinate. I loved it. I felt very privileged to be with people at the most intense moments of their lives and to help them shape those moments. And with my wife founding a congregation in the city, we had 2 separate congregations. And as I'm sure you might well imagine, having one rabbi in a family is quite stressful. Having 2 separate ones in 2 separate congregations brought our family nearly to the breaking point. At the time, the Holy One was awakening in me and cracking open my neshama for a rabbinic journey, a new rabbinic journey that I never could have imagined. Fast forward a few years, I needed this new job. A funder brought me to Glide, and I sat in room 400 at 330 Ellis Street across the table from Janice Mirkatani, who died a few years ago, who was the wife of Reverend Cecil Williams, with Reverend Williams, who's 94. I think of the 2 of them as the Yodas of the San Francisco justice world, who were elders who helped shape San Francisco in many ways. And Reverend Cecil looked at me and he said, "What would it be like to have a rabbi at Glide?" None of us really knew. Next to me was Stephanie Rapp from the Walter and Elise Haas Foundation. And she is the one who said that Jews have been jealous of Glide for close to 100 years, right? Why is there not a Jewish Glide? Why have the Jews not been able to replicate this, right? And she said, she had this novel idea, rather than spending $50 or $100 million to build the Jewish Glide in downtown San Francisco, she said, why don't we plant the Jew at Glide and then open up doors broadly to the Jewish community across the Bay and around the world. Side note, I was sitting in my office yesterday on the 4th floor. 50-year-old, not Jewish young man who helps, young man, for 55, he's young, right? He calls me up, James Sampaga, and he said, "Rabbi, I got a group of Jews from Israel and Miami and Chicago downstairs here. Can you come down and hang out?" And this happens once, I would say every week or 2, I get a call that there's a group of Jews who've come from around the world. They've heard about the great things, and I'm often teaching them about the work that we do. Before COVID, every Jewish day school from Palo Alto to Marin County was coming into Glide, learning Jewish texts ahead of time, and then walking and living Torah in the halls of Glide and in the Tenderloin. In July of 2017, I started a new job without a job description. Bit by bit, Glide gave me a few things, and I created some projects. As Rabbi Prosnit said, the executive director came to me and said, "Do you know anything about teaching police officers and district attorneys?" I said, "I know bar mitzvahs, weddings, funerals, maybe," right? Over time, we created a project called An Officer and a Mensch, where we bring in 20 to 40 police officers and district attorneys at a time for a 3-day immersive, I call it, pilgrimage into the Tenderloin, where I invite them to come out of uniform and to meet me in front of Glide at 6:30 a.m. I invite them to walk the neighborhood for an hour. Say, I want you to imagine that this was your bedroom. Imagine that you slept outside. I said, I don't want you to feel unsafe, but I don't mind you feeling uncomfortable. And then I invite them to wait in the Glide food line, not with your buddies. I want you to stand by yourself to feel what it's like to feel alone. And then throughout the day, we meet Glide staff. We're introducing the Glide clients with lived experience. And I can say that when the DA from Yolo County, DA Reisig, was taking a harm reduction tour of the neighborhood, he said to me, I think every district attorney from all over California should come do this officer and a mensch program. So slowly in motion with that. Every Friday morning at Glide, we bake 120 challahs in the Glide basement. I'm gonna say this, I like carbs a lot, okay? I think it's the best challah in the Bay. We need volunteers. If you're ever looking to get a good challah recipe, or you want to bake or serve folks, we don't feed them to Glide clients. As Stephanie Rapp, my first funder, said to me, we should feed the people who feed people. We walk these loaves of 120 of them of hot Jewish Shabbat bread around the building, the perfume the entire building, to Glide staff who commute from long ways and do immeasurably hard work. and say Shabbat Shalom, even to those who don't celebrate Shabbat. And the reason you really should come with us is we have one rule. We say a little blessing before we walk around. We say motzi in Hebrew once, we said it in Arabic, and then we share a little bread. And someone brings in a stick of salted European butter, and the rule is more butter than you think you deserve, right? So if that was not enough to get you up to 280 to the 101, right, I promise you really good salted European butter. Where that meets hot glide challah, I think the Messiah might land right there. So I got to Glide about a year before Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative opened up their museum and a memorial. I said to Reverend Cecil, I think we should bring maybe 10 people to the opening, and we ended up bringing 85 people to the opening of the museum and the memorial in April of 2018. We brought 25 frontline Glide staff members with us, people with lived experience, people who had spent time on the street, people who had spent time incarcerated, people who were wrestling with addiction and mental health issues, along with civic and tech leaders. And like I would treat a journey to Israel and Palestine when I was a congregational rabbi, we treated the journeys to Alabama in the same way. Long before we landed on the ground in Montgomery, we met multiple times at Glide. We shared meals, we shared stories, we tried to build out loving, covenantal relationships with one another. And we read hard texts and hard stories about lynchings and about systemic racism, and it was really, really hard, so that by the time we got on the ground there, we had coalesced community into a coalescence group into a community that was capable of loving and learning together in deep ways. Hands down, I can say to you that journey in 2018 was the most powerful and searingly powerful journey I had ever been on in America. When we came back, Glide's leadership said that amazing work you did, Rabbi. How might we dial up the power of this trip in coming years? And I sat with some leaders from the Kitchen, my wife Noah's congregation in the city, who uttered some words to me that I'd never thought of before with my rabbinic brain. What if we thought about racial justice and health equity issues? Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, had helped me think deeply about racism in the criminal justice system, but I'd never thought about racism in healthcare. And so bit by bit, we set about infiltrating circles of healthcare power locally and regionally. And so by the time we got to our third pilgrimage, hold these dates for a minute, March 1st through March 5th of 2020, right? Does anyone remember what was happening in the world, right? It's a good laugh now, isn't it? March 1st through March 5th of 1st through 5th of 2020, we had 110 people on the ground in Alabama. My mom was on a cruise ship somewhere over there. My brother and I were just like it was just, you can imagine the worry. We told people to wash their hands a lot. None of us knew what a mask was. We had provost from UC San Francisco with us, many vice chancellors, people across the pediatrics department, and we had built out an extra 3 days to the pilgrimage to meet incredible healthcare leaders who were swimming up against streams that we can't even begin to imagine in Red State, Alabama. We thought deeply about this work, and when we came back from the trip, it was March 5th. I think the world shut down around March 17th or so, and we were supposed to have 3 in-person reunions when we get back to think about how do we elongate the learning of this trip. I was about to say Rabbi Nancy Milliken. She's not a rabbi, she's a doctor. She founded the Center for Excellence in Women's Health at UC San Francisco. Dr. Milliken said, what if we met on Zoom every week? And so that group who was with me in March of 2020 has been meeting every week or 2 on Zoom for 3.5 years now, to think about the through line from what we learned on the ground in Alabama to systemic racism at UCSF, which is the 2nd largest company in San Francisco. It has 35,000 employees. Before, it just bought 2 new hospitals in San Francisco. It pumps about $7.5 billion into the economy. And we're working with their leaders to think about micro and macro aggressions, to think about systems, and how what we saw over there is playing out over here. Our motto for the trip was based on my favorite name for God in the Tanakh. It comes from Psalm 147, verse 3, where the psalmist calls God this: Harofeh l'shivurei lev umechabes la'atzvotam. God is the one who heals their broken hearts and binds up their wounds, right? Hold that for a minute. Think about the holy forces of hearts breaking and healing broken hearts and binding up wounds. And in the first few years of the trip, we said to participants, we're going to bring you to Alabama to break your heart. Our first job is to break people's hearts open. For when you really look head on at the stories that we encounter there, you can't help but have your heart broken. And once we collectively do that work, then we can begin the healing work. What if that was the tissue that binded us? I co-facilitate all this work with a 73-year-old non-Jewish black woman whose title at Glide, before I got there, is the Maven for Transformative Learning, right? Her name is Isoke Femi. She lives in Santa Rosa. She's the best educator I've ever met, and she's like my work wife and soul sister, and we play together a lot, but we do very heavy and hard work. And after year 2 and hearing me say this, we're going to go to break your hearts, she looks at me and she goes, Rabbi, white rabbi, black people and brown people's hearts are broken on an hourly basis here in America. So I think we might need to rebrand this thing. So I pumped my brakes and opened up my humble heart, and we put our heads together and we thought that, what if we rebranded the trip as a warm blanket for black and brown participants on the trip and as an alarm clock for white folks who are coming? What if we think about the different experiences of people who are going on this interracial, interclass, interreligious group and tend to people individually and do the work? We often meet in racial affinity groups along the way, and help us heal individually and collectively and think deeply about the experiences of everyone. So by the time we got to our 2023 trip, the Chancellor of UCSF, Chancellor Hoggood, came with us, the police chief came with us, and about 6 weeks ago, we came back from our 5th Alabama Justice Pilgrimage. I'm gonna tell you a little bit of the makeup of this group. We had 10 people from Glide's Violence Intervention Program. We have a program at Glide called Men in Progress, which instead of spending time incarcerated, a group of men can choose to participate in a 52-week court-mandated program where they come to learn with a mighty team of our staff who helps people unlearn violence. We talk about trauma-informed care at Glide. We want to think about the trauma that these men have been through recently and long ago and help them unpack that and think deeply about that, and then to try to, the rabbi would say, make tshuva for that. How do we help heal from those wounds? On top of the 10 people from Glide's Men in Progress program, we had 35 people from UCSF spanning the hierarchy of power and structure in the institution. We summoned leaders from our patient care assistants and security folks to many vice chancellors who came with us. I have a million stories I could tell you, and I'll tell you more after services, but because I don't want to keep you here until Pesach, I'm going to share with you 2, okay? 2 stories for you tonight. Story number 1. After our second trip, Isoke, our Maven for Transformative Learning, said to me, Rabbi, if we're only going to look at stories of trauma, if we're only going to go look at pain, I'm not coming. We need to balance out these trips by encountering and witnessing what Isoke calls black medicine. The wisdom and creativity and brilliance and resilience of black people and black communities. How Isoke wants our justice pilgrims to know, how have black people not only survived for 400 years of systemic racial terrorism, how are they still here? How have they tethered themselves to life? How have they bubbled with creativity and a seemingly unstoppable force of life for over 4 centuries? Because of this question, because of her agitation, because of this quest to hold both the intensity and vibrancy together, our itinerary toggles back and forth between promise and pain. We visited so-called dispensaries of black spiritual medicine, black pharmacists every day on the trip this year. We began the pilgrimage on Sunday morning at the 16th Street Baptist Church with a wildly alive spiritual community, singing and dancing and celebrating and organizing at this site best known for the KKK terrorist bombing 61 years ago that killed 4 little girls who went to church on Sunday morning. We spent 8 hours on campus at Tuskegee University, a historically black college where we not only met with the chief medical ethics officer and learned deeply about the United States government healthcare's purposeful infection of black men with syphilis, and learned deeply about how when the cure came, they did not give these men the cure. We met with student leaders and activists and artists. We built out partnerships between Glide and UCSF and Tuskegee. And we closed our trip with the incomparably righteous and vivacious Michelle Browder at the Mothers of Gynecology site in Montgomery. These so-called black pharmacists and black pharmacies lit us up with their wisdom, their generous and generative spirits, with confidence that healing is in constant motion. Their indomitable souls not only fueled us, they pointed us towards the redemptive possibility and promise of staying in this work for the long haul. Story number 2 is a bit heavier. I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of the nurse managers from UCSF who is with us. I'll call him Jonathan tonight. He's a gay black man, my gut says in his mid-40s, full of light and love. If you're in the hospital, this is the nurse you want by your bedside, right? Deep skills, deep soul, full of light and full of love. On the day that we visited the Legacy Museum, on the day that we spent 4 hours inside this museum that just shatters you and tells the story about how millions of Africans were picked up and robbed from their homes and their communities and brought across the Atlantic to build railroads and cities and communities. After spending 4 hours in this museum that tells that birth story and its evolution to mass incarceration of people of color, we sat for lunch for 90 minutes, everyone from UCSF. We pumped the brakes and we thought, what do people from UCSF see in this museum that connects back to their work at UCSF? And Jonathan looked at our group in the cafeteria there in the museum and he said, I want to quit my job each and every day. Right? Hold this. Like the best nurse you could ever imagine. Leads hundreds of nurses. He's like, I want to quit my job each and every day because of the micro and macroaggressions I face. Because of the overt and covert racism I face not only from patients, but from my supervisors, from the systems I encounter. We heard at that lunch dozens more brutal UCSF truths that surfaced in those 90 minutes. We saw the pain in his eyes, we felt it in his voice. After lunch that day, we walked up the hill to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, this immeasurably brutal visit that tells the story, as I said earlier, of the 4,400 known victims of lynching. The next day, we flew back from Montgomery to Dallas, and from Dallas back to San Francisco, and I was on the plane with Jonathan, and when I was in the airport with him, I said, did you go to church growing up? I'm just seeing a wildly alive, spiritually oriented soul. And he said to me, Rabbi, my dad's a pastor. And I said, when did you come out? He said, to my dad or to everyone else? He said, well, to everyone I came out when I was 21, but to my dad, I waited a decade till I was 31. He said, are you ready for this, Rabbi? We're literally on the jetway at the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, and he pulls out his cell phone, and he holds up a photograph. For those of you who have been, or those of you who know the lynching memorial, it's the most powerful building piece of architecture I've ever been in. It's a rectangle, and you walk around the rectangle inside, and hanging from the ceiling are 800 Core 10 steel boxes, right? You start off meandering through them, and then the floor slowly descends, and the boxes start hanging above your head and swing a bit in the wind like lynched bodies. And on each of these 800 boxes is the name of a county and the name of everyone known lynched in those counties. So there I am on the jetway, and James says, "You see this, Rabbi? See that county in South Carolina? See that name on there? There's one name on there." He said, "That's my great uncle. My great uncle was lynched." I took some deep breaths. I held that for a minute. Think about your great uncles for a minute. He said to me, "Rabbi, my dad never told me this story about our great uncle. He wanted to fend the trauma off, right?" He then said to me, "Rabbi, my dad is the one who signed my excommunication papers kicking me out of the church." Hold this for a minute. Hold this dad's position for a minute. Dad whose uncle was killed and brutalized, right, in South Carolina for politically organizing in South Carolina. Dad knows this story. Dad's a pastor now, has a son who's black and gay in the South and dating white men. Dad is afraid what happened to him is going to happen to him, and does everything he can to try to protect him and keep him alive. We get back to San Francisco late at night. As I said, we have weekly reunions for this group. When we come back to Glide the following week, Jonathan sits in the circle, and he, after lots of spiritual processing with me, with Isoke, with other leaders from the trip, he said a few things to us. He said, "I understand my family trauma in new ways." He said, "I'm forgiving my father in ways I never thought possible." And he said, "Thanks to this Alabama justice pilgrimage, I now see my role much more clearly at UCSF. I now see why I'm here." Jonathan's story pointed us towards hope, towards the possibility of bringing healing to generations-old wounds. The way we define a pilgrimage at Glide is a journey of personal, spiritual discovery that forever changes you. Right? A journey of personal, spiritual discovery that forever changes you. Rabbi Larry Hoffman delineates between what is a trip, which is a lot of this and get the souvenirs, and a pilgrimage, which is a lot more of this. When Brian Stevenson came to Congregation Road of Shalom 12 years ago, he hit on 4 points, which have become the Torah of my justice work. You can see him in his TED Talk. If you don't know Brian Stevenson, after Shabbos, you have to watch his TED Talk. You have to read his book, Just Mercy. You should go see the movie, Just Mercy. You should put your shekels aside and get yourself to Alabama. I'll help plot out your itinerary for you. But the 4 points Brian taught us, which are, as I said, the Torah of my justice work. You got to get proximate, right? Me, when I was sitting on a house on a hill in Marin County, where I lived for 14 years, versus walking Ellis Street, right? There's a power in looking people in the eye. And maybe there was a little surprise when I said tonight that Tenderloin is the friendliest, most generous neighborhood in town. I invite you to come see it, right? I promise you, we'll deliver it. I'll introduce you to people who are some of the most generous people you've ever known. I want you to get proximate, Brian said. He says, we need to imagine new narratives. Us versus them, Jews, Christians, Muslims, right? I do think these 4 points apply to Israel, Palestine as well, but that's next week's sermon. He's giving it, not me. Okay, got to get proximate, got to imagine new narratives. The 3rd point he said is you have to hold on to hope, right? The opposite of hope is injustice. If I don't believe we can turn the Tenderloin, if we don't believe we can turn Israel, Palestine, we might as well move to Boca and get a tan, right? The work here is to hold fast to hope. And the last one, the hardest one, is to do uncomfortable things. It's much easier looking out the window here in Los Altos Hills and your beautiful campus, like everyone on the planet talks about the campus of your storied congregation. Much easier to sit in the sanctuary than it is to walk Ellis Street, right? When I can tell you when I walk past people face down on the sidewalk where I'm not actually sure if they're still alive. Much harder. But there's something in that that agitates, that propels me, that invites me and you into the work. Proximity, imagine new narratives, hold on to hope, do uncomfortable things. My last story for you tonight is about my most important tzedakah teacher. The person who taught me more about righteous living and righteous giving is a woman named Carol Levy. She died about 12 years ago. I met her when I was 22. The story I'll tell you about Carol tonight is that she left her house every day with 2 purses. One purse, cell phone, keys, wallet, lipstick, always a rockin' lipstick, okay? Second one was her tzedakah purse. Every day, 50 cents, $50, granola bar, gift card, pair of socks. She said, I want to walk through the world with 0 cholesterol in my generosity system. I want to be giving. I don't want to be asking questions on any level. This is how I'm going to walk through the world. Carol helped us think about what she called as a justice practice. You know, we want our kids or grandkids to practice flute or football or tennis, right? She's like, what if we got much better with our tzedakah practices? So I want to leave you tonight with this vision. How might we collectively as our community to build on Rabbi Akselrad and your community's mighty tradition here, think deeply about how we might increasingly build out practices that help us get proximate, that help us imagine new narratives, that help us hold on to hope, and that really push us to do uncomfortable things. Shabbat Shalom.